In the year 1221, the most feared conqueror in human history faced an impossible humiliation. Genghis Khan, who had crushed empires and brought emperors to their knees, stood before a fortress held by 15,000 desperate refugees. What happened next would become the Mongol Empire's most closely guarded secret, a defeat so shocking it nearly vanished from history itself. By 1220, Genghis Khan had transformed from a tribal outcast into the ruler of the largest contiguous empire the world had ever seen. His armies had swept across China, crushing the Jin dynasty. They had destroyed the Khwarazmian Empire, once the jewel of Central Asia, reducing its magnificent cities to ashes and ruins. The Mongol war machine operated with a precision that instilled fear in the minds of medieval people. Their composite bows could pierce armor from distances that seemed impossible. Their cavalry reached their targets before news of their approach could even spread, appearing like demons from the steppes before defenders had time to prepare. Genghis Khan had become more than a man in the eyes of both his followers and his enemies. He was seen as an unstoppable force of nature, like an inevitable natural disaster. His generals had become legendary: Subutai, the brilliant strategist, and Jebi, the warrior whose arrows never missed. Together, they had perfected the art of psychological warfare, sending fear ahead of their armies like an invisible weapon. Cities would surrender at the mere rumor of the Mongols' approach. Those who resisted faced such devastating destruction that even chroniclers struggled to find words to describe it. Yet within this seemingly limitless power, a crack was about to form. The Mongols were advancing toward a fortress they believed would fall within days, perhaps even hours. They could not have imagined that this place would become the site of one of their most humiliating defeats, a wound to their pride that would linger for generations. The city of Parwan stood as a testament to centuries of Persian architectural brilliance, its walls rising from the Afghan highlands like a crown of stone. However, this story is not about Parwan itself, but about a fortress hidden in the shadow of the Hindu Kush Mountains, a place the locals called an impregnable sanctuary. Before its destruction, the Khwarazmian Empire had been a marvel of the medieval world. Its capital, Gurganj, was home to libraries that rivaled those of Baghdad. Its merchants traded from the Mediterranean to the Pacific. Shah Muhammad II ruled over millions and commanded armies, numbering in the hundreds of thousands. Then came the Mongol storm, growing like an avalanche. In 1219, a diplomatic crisis triggered by the massacre of Mongol merchants became the spark that ignited total war. Genghis Khan demanded justice, but the Shah responded with defiance and insult. It was a fatal miscalculation. The Mongol invasion of Khwarezm became a masterclass in military destruction. Cities fell one after another. In Otrar, the governor who had killed the Mongol merchants was executed by having molten silver poured into his eyes and ears. In Bukhara, the great mosque was turned into a stable for Mongol horses, and Samarkand, the jewel of the Silk Road, surrendered after witnessing the fate of those who resisted. By 1221, the Khwarazmian Empire existed only as a memory. Shah Muhammad died as a fugitive on an island in the Caspian Sea, defeated and broken. His son, Jalal ad-Din, had become a prince without a kingdom, fleeing toward the mountains with the remnants of his father's army, realizing that escape was his only option. Jalal ad-Din Mingbornu was 30 years old when his world collapsed. Unlike his father, who had proven to be a poor military strategist and worse politician, Jalal ad-Din possessed genuine martial talent and personal courage that inspired fierce loyalty. As the Mongol armies carved through his father's empire like a hot blade through butter, Jalal ad-Din had fought a series of desperate rearguard actions, buying time for civilians to flee and salvaging what military forces he could from the wreckage. His name meant Majesty of the Faith, Burner of Idols, and he carried it with a pride that bordered on recklessness. Where his father had hidden and fled, Jalal ad-Din chose to fight. He gathered to his banner not a proper army, but a collection of survivors, soldiers who had escaped the fall of their cities, tribal warriors from the mountains, desperate men who preferred death in battle to slow starvation or Mongol captivity. By the winter of 1221, his army numbered perhaps 15,000 souls, though calling it an army was generous. Many were wounded. Supplies were desperately short. They had few horses compared to the Mongol cavalry that hunted them. They were exhausted, demoralized, and running out of places to run. Jalal ad-Din led them toward the fortress of Parwan in the region we now call Afghanistan. The terrain was his ally here: narrow valleys, high mountains, places where Mongol cavalry superiority would count for less. He knew he could not win a war against Genghis Khan, but perhaps, just perhaps, he could win a single battle. Perhaps he could restore some dignity to his shattered people. Perhaps he could prove that the Mongols were not, after all, invincible demons, but mortal men who could bleed. To understand the magnitude of what was about to occur, one must first comprehend the Mongol military system that had conquered half the known world. The Mongol army was not merely a collection of fierce warriors. It was a sophisticated machine built on principles that would not be matched in Europe for centuries. Every Mongol soldier was a cavalryman from childhood, practically born in the saddle. Their composite bows made from horn, wood, and sinew could shoot arrows over 300 meters with enough force to penetrate armor. They carried multiple types of arrows, light ones for distance, heavy ones for penetration, even whistling arrows used for signaling. Each warrior maintained a string of horses, allowing them to cover distances that seemed impossible to their enemies. A Mongol force could travel 100 kilometers in a day, appearing where defenders thought they had weeks to prepare. Their intelligence network was equally impressive. Merchants, spies, and informants provided detailed information about enemy territories long before the armies arrived. The Mongols knew the political divisions of their enemies, the quality of their fortifications, the character of their leaders. They exploited every weakness with ruthless efficiency. Their tactical flexibility was revolutionary. They could execute complex maneuvers involving tens of thousands of horsemen, coordinating movements across vast distances using flags, whistles, and messengers. The feigned retreat, where Mongol forces would appear to flee in panic only to lead pursuers into ambushes, had destroyed countless armies who thought they were winning. Terror was their ally. The Mongols cultivated their reputation for mercilessness deliberately. Cities that surrendered quickly were often spared. Those that resisted faced such complete destruction that others would surrender rather than fight. Genghis Khan assigned the pursuit of Jalal ad-Din to a force of approximately 30,000 warriors under the command of Shigi Kutuk, an adopted son of the Khan himself, and accompanied by several experienced generals. This was a substantial force, larger than most medieval armies, yet considered merely a pursuit detachment by Mongol standards. The Mongols tracked Jalal ad-Din's refugees through the mountains with the patience of wolves following wounded prey. They were in no particular hurry. Where could their quarry go? Every direction led either to more Mongol armies or to impassable terrain. The net was closing inexorably. Shigi Kutuk was confident, perhaps overconfident. He had participated in numerous campaigns and witnessed the Mongol military machine crush every opponent it faced. These refugees, this ragtag collection of survivors led by a desperate prince, represented no real threat. The outcome was predetermined. Only the details remained to be written. The Mongol commanders expected that when they finally cornered Jalal ad-Din's forces, the refugees would either surrender or be massacred in a brief one-sided engagement. Either outcome was acceptable. What they did not expect was that their quarry might choose to turn and fight on ground of their own choosing. In late 1221, Mongol scouts reported that Jalal ad-Din had stopped running. He had taken position near Parwan, in a valley where the terrain favored defenders. The Mongol generals reviewed this information with interest but little concern. Favorable terrain could delay the inevitable, but it could not prevent it. They had faced desperate last stands before. They always ended the same way. The Mongol force advanced toward Parwan, expecting to add another victory to their long list of conquests. They could not have imagined they were riding toward humiliation. Jalal ad-Din knew he could not outrun the Mongols forever. His people were exhausted, supplies were nearly gone, and winter was approaching. If he continued to flee, his force would simply disintegrate through attrition, starvation, and desertion. He made a decision that seemed suicidal to many of his advisors. He would stop and fight, but not in the open field where Mongol cavalry would massacre his inferior forces. He chose his ground with the eye of a born tactician. Near Parwan, the terrain offered possibilities. Narrow valleys would constrain the Mongol cavalry's ability to maneuver. Rocky outcrops could provide defensive positions. The river could protect one flank. He positioned his forces carefully, placing his best remaining troops in the center, using the terrain to compensate for his numerical and tactical disadvantages. His men were desperate, which could be either a fatal weakness or a source of strength. Desperate men sometimes break and run at the first setback. But sometimes when they have nothing left to lose, they fight with a ferocity that well-fed, confident soldiers cannot match. Jalal ad-Din moved among his troops, speaking words of encouragement, reminding them what they were fighting for. Not for empire or glory, but for survival, for the chance to see their families again, for dignity in the face of annihilation. He told them that the Mongols were not invincible demons, but men who could be hurt and defeated. He reminded them of their own military traditions, the proud history of Persian and Turkic warriors who had never bowed easily to any conqueror. And he made them a promise. If they stood firm, if they fought with courage, they could achieve the impossible. They could defeat the Mongols. Many did not believe him, but they were willing to die trying, and that would have to be enough. The Mongol force arrived at Parwan expecting a quick victory. What they found was an enemy that refused to behave as defeated refugees should. Jalal ad-Din's forces were arrayed in defensive positions that maximized the terrain's natural advantages. The Mongols, accustomed to fighting on open steppes where their cavalry could execute sweeping maneuvers, found themselves constrained by narrow valleys and rocky slopes. Shigi Kutuk ordered a probing attack, expecting the enemy line to crumble under pressure. Instead, his forces met fierce resistance. The defenders fought with the desperation of men who knew retreat meant death. They held their positions, inflicting casualties on the Mongol vanguard. This was unexpected but not yet alarming. The Mongol commanders regrouped and prepared a more substantial assault. They had numbers, they had experience, and they had the reputation of invincibility on their side. Surely these refugees could not withstand a determined attack. The second assault was more powerful, better coordinated. Mongol cavalry attempted to flank the defensive positions while archers provided covering fire. For a time, it seemed the familiar pattern would reassert itself. Mongol tactical superiority would overcome inferior opponents, but Jalal ad-Din proved to be a more capable commander than the Mongols had anticipated. He shifted his reserves to threaten points, shoring up his line before it could break. His own archers, though fewer in number, found good positions among the rocks and exacted a toll on the attackers. The terrain that constrained his forces also constrained the Mongols, negating much of their advantage in mobility. As the day wore on, the Mongol commanders found themselves in an unfamiliar position. Their attacks were being repulsed, casualties were mounting, the enemy was not breaking. As the battle entered its second day, something remarkable began to happen. The Mongol attacks, which had always seemed irresistible, were not just being stopped, but were being thrown back with increasing effectiveness. Jalal ad-Din's men, who had started the battle exhausted and demoralized, discovered that the Mongols could bleed, they could be hurt, they could be beaten. This realization transformed the defenders. The psychological advantage that had carried the Mongols through countless battles suddenly reversed. Now it was the refugees who fought with the confidence of inevitable victory, while the Mongols found themselves uncertain and off balance. Jalal ad-Din sensed the shift in momentum and made a bold decision. Rather than simply defending, he would counterattack. He personally led a charge against the Mongol center, his best troops following him in a wedge formation designed to break through the enemy line. It was a desperate gamble, If the charge failed, if the Mongol line held, his forces would be shattered and the battle lost. But if it succeeded, if his men could break through and create chaos in the Mongol rear, the impossible might become possible. The charge struck the Mongol line like a thunderbolt. Jalal ad-Din fought in the thick of the combat, his presence inspiring his men to superhuman efforts. The Mongol center, already shaken by 2 days of unexpectedly fierce resistance, buckled under the assault. Gaps appeared in their formation. The disciplined Mongol battle line, which had held firm against countless enemies, began to fragment. Shigi Kutuk attempted to restore order, to rally his troops and seal the breach, but the psychological damage was done. For the first time in this campaign, perhaps for the first time in years, Mongol soldiers began to retreat not as a tactical maneuver but in actual flight. The Mongol retreat became a rout. Soldiers who had conquered empires fled in panic before an enemy they had expected to crush with ease. The carefully maintained Mongol discipline, which had been their greatest strength, collapsed in the face of unexpected defeat. Jalal ad-Din's forces pursued the fleeing Mongols, inflicting heavy casualties. The hunters had become the hunted. The invincible had been defeated. The refugees who had expected to die in a last desperate stand found themselves victorious on the field of battle. The psychological impact of the victory was even greater than the tactical success. Word spread rapidly through the region. The Mongols had been beaten. They were not invincible demons, but mortal men who could be defeated by courage and good leadership. For Jalal ad-Din and his followers, it was a moment of incredible triumph. Against impossible odds, with inferior numbers and exhausted troops, they had achieved what no other force had managed in years of Mongol conquests. They had won a clear, undeniable victory in open battle. The celebration in Jalal ad-Din's camp that night was bittersweet. They had won a battle, but the war was far from over. Genghis Khan commanded hundreds of thousands of warriors. The force they had defeated was merely one detachment of a much larger army. Nevertheless, for this moment they could savor the impossible. They had humiliated the Mongol Empire. They had proven that resistance was not futile. They had given hope to everyone who suffered under the Mongol advance. Jalal ad-Din had transformed himself from a fugitive prince into a legitimate military leader, someone who could stand against the storm and not be swept away. His name would be remembered, his victory celebrated in songs and stories. But even in victory, he knew the truth. The Mongols would come again, in greater numbers and with vengeance in their hearts. When news of the defeat reached Genghis Khan, his reaction was one of cold, calculated fury. The Khan was not a man given to emotional outbursts. His anger was far more dangerous than mere rage. He had built an empire on the foundation of Mongol military invincibility. Every victory reinforced the psychological advantage that made future victories easier. Enemies surrendered because they believed resistance was futile. Cities opened their gates because they feared the consequences of defiance. The defeat at Parwan threatened this carefully constructed image. If word spread that the Mongols could be beaten, that they were not invincible, it could inspire resistance throughout the empire. Rebellions might erupt in conquered territories. Future enemies might choose to fight rather than surrender. The defeat was not merely a military setback. It was a threat to the entire imperial system. Genghis Khan immediately began preparing a response. He would not send another detachment or assign the task to subordinates. He would lead the main Mongol army personally to crush Jalal ad-Din and restore the aura of invincibility. The Khan gathered his forces, calling in troops from other campaigns. He assembled an army that dwarfed the force that had been defeated at Parwan. This would not be a pursuit by a single detachment but a full imperial campaign with overwhelming force. Genghis Khan also issued orders regarding the treatment of Jalal ad-Din when he was finally captured. The prince would not be granted the quick end usually afforded to worthy opponents. His defeat would be public and humiliating, a lesson to anyone who might consider resistance. The Khan understood that defeating Jalal ad-Din militarily was not enough. The psychological victory had to be reclaimed, the myth of invincibility restored. As the massive Mongol army began to move, Jalal ad-Din's scouts brought increasingly alarming reports. The victory at Parwan had bought time and restored morale, but now the full weight of the Mongol Empire was descending upon them. Jalal ad-Din understood the strategic reality with painful clarity. His victory at Parwan had been possible because of favorable terrain, tactical surprise, and facing a single Mongol detachment. Against the full might of Genghis Khan's main army, in open battle, his forces would be annihilated. He had no choice but to retreat once again, to seek new defensive positions or allies who might help him resist the coming storm. He led his forces south and east toward the Indus River and the borders of the Delhi Sultanate. Perhaps the Sultan of Delhi, seeing an opportunity to check Mongol expansion, would provide sanctuary or support. Perhaps the terrain beyond the Indus would offer new defensive possibilities. The retreat was agonizing. After the euphoria of victory, returning to the role of fugitive was psychologically devastating for his troops. Some deserted, believing that continued resistance was futile. Others stayed out of personal loyalty to Jalal ad-Din or because they had nowhere else to go. The Mongol pursuit was relentless. Genghis Khan's army moved with terrifying speed, covering ground that seemed impossible for such a large force. Jalal ad-Din's rear guard fought a series of desperate delaying actions, sacrificing themselves to buy time for the main body to escape. The landscape became increasingly rugged as they approached the Indus. High mountains, narrow passes, and the great river itself created obstacles for both pursued and pursuers. Jalal ad-Din hoped that the terrain would slow the Mongols enough for him to establish a defensive position or cross the river to safety. But the Khan's forces adapted to the terrain with their usual efficiency. They found paths through the mountains, secured crossings at rivers, and maintained their pursuit without let-up. By late 1221, Jalal ad-Din found himself trapped against the Indus River with the entire Mongol army closing in. His moment of triumph at Parwan was about to be overshadowed by catastrophe. The Indus River, one of the great waterways of Asia, now became both potential salvation and deadly trap. Jalal ad-Din's forces reached the river's bank in late November or early December of 1221, with the Mongol army only hours behind them. The river was wide, deep, and flowing fast with winter meltwater from the mountains. Crossing it quickly with an entire army was impossible. Jalal ad-Din had perhaps 20,000 soldiers at this point, having gathered some additional forces during his retreat, but many were exhausted and demoralized. Behind them came Genghis Khan with perhaps 60 to 70,000 warriors, fresh and eager for vengeance. The tactical situation was hopeless. The river at their backs eliminated any possibility of retreat or maneuver. The Mongols would simply advance, pin them against the water, and methodically destroy them. Some of Jalal ad-Din's commanders suggested immediate surrender, hoping for mercy. Others proposed attempting a desperate river crossing, even though many would certainly drown. Jalal ad-Din chose a third option. He would fight one last battle, not with any hope of victory, but to allow as many of his people as possible to escape across the river. He arrayed his forces in a defensive line facing the Mongol approach, with the river at their backs. It was a position that violated every principle of military tactics, the kind of deployment that led to complete annihilation. But Jalal ad-Din was not trying to win a battle. He was trying to buy time. As the Mongol army approached, Genghis Khan himself observed the trapped enemy with satisfaction. The prince who had dared to defeat a Mongol force would now pay the price for his audacity. The Khan ordered his army to advance, to crush the enemy against the river and end this troublesome resistance once and for all. The Battle of the Indus began with a massive Mongol assault designed to overwhelm the defenders through sheer force. Waves of cavalry charged the defensive line, arrows darkened the sky, and the sound of combat echoed off the surrounding mountains. Jalal ad-Din's forces fought with the desperation of men who knew they were making their last stand. Every moment they held the line was another moment for civilians and wounded soldiers to attempt the dangerous river crossing behind them. The prince himself fought in the front ranks, his presence inspiring his warriors to superhuman efforts. For hours, the defensive line held against impossible odds. Jalal ad-Din's soldiers, many of them veterans who had survived the destruction of the Khwarazmian Empire and the victory at Parwan, sold their lives dearly. They knew they were dying for a purpose, to save their families, their comrades, their prince. But courage and desperation could only accomplish so much against overwhelming numbers and tactical superiority. Slowly, inexorably, the Mongol assault ground down the defenders. Sections of the line began to collapse. Gaps appeared that could not be filled. The defensive position was disintegrating. Genghis Khan, observing from a command position, recognized that the enemy was on the verge of complete collapse. He ordered a final, overwhelming assault to finish them. As the Mongol forces prepared for the killing blow, Jalal ad-Din made a decision that would become legendary. He had done everything possible to save his people. Most of the civilians and wounded had made it across the river or died trying. His remaining soldiers were exhausted and nearly out of arrows and weapons. Continuing the fight would accomplish nothing except his own capture and execution. He would not give Genghis Khan that satisfaction. He would escape, even if escape seemed impossible. What happened next became one of the most famous moments in medieval military history, an event so dramatic that some historians questioned whether it actually occurred as described. Jalal ad-Din, seeing that all was lost, made his way to the river's edge. He was still mounted on his war horse, a powerful animal that had carried him through countless battles. Behind him, the Mongol army was overwhelming the last of his defenders. Ahead of him, the Indus River flowed wide and deep, its current strong enough to sweep away anything caught in its grip. The far bank seemed impossibly distant. Contemporary chroniclers describe what happened with a mixture of awe and disbelief. Jalal ad-Din spurred his horse toward the river. Rather than attempting to find a shallow crossing or a swimming point, he rode straight for the bank at full gallop. At the river's edge, where the bank dropped away in a steep cliff, he did not slow down. Horse and rider launched into space, arcing out over the water in a leap that defied reason. They fell toward the rushing current far below, a descent that should have ended in death by drowning or impact. Genghis Khan himself witnessed this moment. According to multiple sources, the Khan turned to his sons and commanders and spoke words that revealed his complex character. He did not express triumph at the imminent death of his enemy. Instead, he reportedly said something to the effect that this was what a father should wish for in a son: courage, determination, the refusal to surrender even in the face of certain death. The horse struck the water with tremendous force. Both animal and rider disappeared beneath the surface. Mongol archers fired arrows at the point of impact, but the river's current was already carrying their target away. For long moments, there was no sign of either horse or rider. Then, incredibly, Jalal ad-Din surfaced, still in the saddle, his horse swimming powerfully toward the far bank. Genghis Khan's reaction to Jalal ad-Din's escape revealed dimensions of his character that are often overlooked in simplified portrayals of the Mongol conqueror. He was capable of terrible ruthlessness, yes, but also of recognizing and respecting genuine courage and ability in his enemies. As Jalal ad-Din's horse struggled toward the far bank, carrying the prince to temporary safety, the Khan ordered his archers to cease fire. Some sources suggest he even forbade pursuit, though this detail is debated by historians. What is clear is that Genghis Khan expressed admiration for his enemy's courage and resourcefulness. The Khan's respect for Jalal ad-Din did not mean he would stop pursuing him, of course. The prince remained a threat to Mongol dominance in the region and a symbol of resistance that could inspire others. But the Khan's acknowledgement of his enemy's qualities was significant in Mongol culture, where personal courage and martial ability were the highest virtues. This moment at the Indus River encapsulated the complex relationship between the two men. Genghis Khan had built an empire through military genius, ruthless pragmatism, and the ability to inspire absolute loyalty in his followers. Jalal ad-Din, defending a dying empire with inadequate resources, had shown comparable courage and tactical ability. In another time, another place, the Khan might have sought to recruit such a capable warrior rather than destroy him. For the Mongol soldiers who witnessed the escape, the moment was instructive. Their Khan was teaching them that courage deserved respect even in an enemy, that the warrior's code transcended the immediate demands of conquest. It was a lesson in the values that held Mongol society together even as it conquered half the world. Jalal ad-Din reached the far bank of the Indus and disappeared into the landscape beyond. He had survived the impossible once again, but his victory at Parwan and his legendary escape would be the high points of his resistance. The war was far from over. The Battle of Parwan and its aftermath had significant consequences that rippled through the medieval world. For the Mongol Empire, the defeat was a rare blemish on an otherwise unbroken string of victories. Genghis Khan took steps to ensure it would not be repeated, refining Mongol tactics and emphasizing the importance of thorough reconnaissance and respect for capable enemies. The commanders who had been defeated at Parwan faced consequences for their failure, though the historical record is unclear about their exact fate. What is certain is that the Mongol military learned from the experience, studying what had gone wrong and adapting their methods accordingly. For the broader region, Parwan provided a glimmer of hope in a dark time. Word of the victory spread throughout Central Asia, Persia, and beyond. It proved that the Mongols could be beaten, that resistance was not entirely futile. This knowledge stiffened resistance in some areas and inspired continued opposition to Mongol rule. However, the victory's practical impact was limited. Jalal ad-Din's triumph had been tactical, not strategic. He had won a battle but lost the war. The Khwarazmian Empire remained destroyed, its cities in ruins, its population scattered or subjugated. The prince's subsequent attempts to rebuild his power and resist the Mongols would meet with mixed success and eventual failure. The Battle of Parwan became a subject of historical and literary interest in the Islamic world. Poets celebrated Jalal ad-Din's courage and tactical brilliance. Historians debated the details of the battle and its significance. The prince became a symbol of resistance against overwhelming odds, a reminder that courage and skill could sometimes triumph over superior force. For military historians, Parwan offered valuable lessons about the importance of terrain, the value of defensive positions against mobile forces, and the role of leadership in motivating troops. It demonstrated that even the most successful military system had vulnerabilities that could be exploited by a skilled and determined opponent. After his escape across the Indus, Jalal ad-Din spent several years attempting to rebuild his power and continue resistance against the Mongols. He found temporary refuge in the Delhi Sultanate, though the Sultan proved unwilling to provide substantial military support against the Mongol Empire. The prince eventually made his way back to Persia, where he attempted to carve out a new kingdom from the chaos left by the Mongol invasions. For a time, he achieved some success. He gathered followers, won several battles against local rivals and Mongol detachments, and established control over parts of Persia and the Caucasus. His reputation as the man who had defeated the Mongols at Parwan helped him recruit warriors and intimidate opponents. But Jalal ad-Din's character, which had served him well as a resistance leader, proved problematic as a ruler. He was brave to the point of recklessness, proud to the point of arrogance. He made enemies unnecessarily, alienated potential allies, and failed to build the stable administrative structure necessary for lasting power. His military campaigns, while sometimes successful, exhausted his resources and his followers. The Mongols had not forgotten him. Though Genghis Khan died in 1227, his successors continued to view Jalal ad-Din as a threat and a symbol of resistance that needed to be eliminated. They sent multiple expeditions against him, gradually wearing down his forces and limiting his territory. By 1231, Jalal ad-Din's power had largely collapsed. He was once again a fugitive, fleeing from both Mongol armies and local enemies he had made during his years of attempting to rebuild his kingdom. In August of that year, he was cornered in the mountains of Kurdistan by forces that may have been Mongol, local Kurdish warriors, or some combination of both. The exact circumstances of his end remain unclear, lost in the confusion of medieval chronicles and legend. What is certain is that Jalal ad-Din Mingburnu died as he had lived, fighting against impossible odds, refusing to surrender, defiant to the last. From a military historical perspective, the Battle of Parwan offers valuable insights into the Mongol military system and its vulnerabilities. The Mongols' greatest strengths were their mobility, their composite bows range and power, and their ability to execute complex maneuvers across vast distances. These advantages were most effective on open terrain where their cavalry could maneuver freely. Parwan demonstrated that in constrained terrain, mountains, narrow valleys, fortified positions, many of these advantages were negated. A determined defender with good leadership could exploit terrain to offset the Mongols' numerical and tactical superiority. This was not a unique insight. Defenders throughout history have used terrain to their advantage, but Parwan showed that it could work even against the Mongols, who had developed a reputation for invincibility. The battle also highlighted the importance of morale and leadership. Jalal ad-Din's forces were outnumbered and exhausted, fighting with inferior equipment against the most feared army in the world. Yet they won because their leader inspired them, chose good ground, and made sound tactical decisions during the battle. The psychological dimension of warfare, which the Mongols understood and exploited better than most medieval armies, worked against them at Parwan. The Mongol response to the defeat was equally instructive. Rather than dismissing it as a fluke or punishing the defeated commanders excessively, the Mongol leadership analyzed what had gone wrong and adapted. They became more cautious about pursuing enemies into difficult terrain, improved their intelligence gathering, and ensured that future expeditions had overwhelming force relative to their objectives. This capacity for learning and adaptation was one of the keys to Mongol success. They were not inflexible or bound by tradition. When something worked, they adopted it regardless of its origin. When something failed, they studied why and adjusted their methods. This pragmatic approach to warfare helped them build and maintain the largest contiguous empire in history. The story of Jalal ad-Din and the Battle of Parwan lived on long after the participants were dust. In Persian and Central Asian literature, the prince became a heroic figure, a symbol of resistance against tyranny and foreign conquest. Poets wrote epics about his exploits, often embellishing the historical facts but capturing the emotional truth of a brave man fighting impossible odds. The famous Persian poet and historian Juvaini, writing in the 13th century while serving the Mongol Ilkhanate, treated Jalal ad-Din with respect despite being employed by the descendants of his enemies. This suggests that even among the Mongols and their subjects, the prince's courage commanded admiration. The leap into the Indus River became particularly legendary, taking on almost mythical proportions in some retellings. Some versions had the prince performing impossible feats, his horse flying across the river, arrows bouncing off him through divine protection. These embellishments, while historically questionable, reflected the emotional resonance of the story, one man's defiance in the face of overwhelming power. For modern historians, Jalal ad-Din and Parwan represent a fascinating case study in several areas: the limits of military power, the role of leadership and morale in warfare, the complex relationship between conquerors and the conquered, and the ways that history is remembered and transformed into legend. The battle also serves as a reminder that history is not simply a story of inevitable progress or the triumph of superior force. Individual courage, tactical intelligence, and favorable circumstances can sometimes produce outcomes that seem impossible. The refugees who defeated the Mongol Empire at Parwan, if only temporarily, demonstrated that human agency matters even in the face of overwhelming historical forces. In the end, Jalal ad-Din failed in his larger goal of preserving the Khwarazmian Empire or permanently checking Mongol expansion. But his victory at Parwan ensured that he would be remembered not as just another prince who fell before the Mongol advance, but as a man who fought back and won, if only for a moment. The story of Parwan resonates across the centuries because it touches on universal themes that transcend its specific historical context. It is a story about courage in the face of overwhelming odds, about refusing to surrender even when surrender seems rational. It is about the importance of leadership, the power of terrain and tactics to offset numerical superiority, and the limits of even the most powerful military machines. For military professionals, Parwan offers tactical lessons about the importance of reconnaissance, the dangers of overconfidence, and the value of respecting one's enemy. The Mongols learned these lessons and became even more formidable as a result. For students of history, the battle illustrates how individual events fit into larger patterns. Parwan was a tactical victory that did not change the strategic outcome of the Mongol conquest of Central Asia. Yet it mattered, both in its immediate impact on the morale of those resisting the Mongols and in its long-term influence on how that era was remembered. For general readers, the story of Jalal ad-Din and his 15,000 refugees defeating 30,000 Mongol warriors is simply a gripping tale of human drama. It has heroes and villains, impossible odds and unexpected triumph, tragedy and legend. It reminds us that history is not just abstract forces and inevitable trends, but the sum of individual human choices and actions. The Battle of Parwan stands as a testament to the possibility of resistance, the value of courage, and the enduring power of a well-told story. In 1221, in the mountains of what is now Afghanistan, a group of desperate refugees achieved the impossible. They defeated the Mongol Empire in open battle, humiliating the most feared conquerors of the medieval world. Their victory was temporary, their ultimate defeat perhaps inevitable, but for one shining moment they proved that the impossible was possible, that courage and skill could triumph over overwhelming force. That moment and the man who led them to it deserve to be remembered.